Executive Director of the museum, and it's my pleasure to have you all here today for a great presentation about International Harvester Scouts. We are honored to have Jim Allen and John Glancy here for the presentation today, both co-authors of the book that you see here, which is for sale. They have serial numbered editions at $60 and non-serial numbered editions at $45. They're happy to sign it for you, make it out personally to you, draw a caricature for you, whatever you want. I'm sure they're willing to do it. But it's going to be a great presentation. Want to really extend my thanks to Jim for helping us out in a myriad of ways, including when this vehicle was donated to us, that was the last time that it ran. So it has taken a long time, a lot of work to get it back in running condition. Last year when we went to the Harvester Homecoming, he said, well, if you ever need to get that running, just let me know, I can do it. So we took him up on that offer, and he did get it running. So we were able to have it out the day before this year's International Harvester Homecoming here on the property, and that allows us to continue to maintain it so that it will always be able to be put into running condition pretty easily. So I know this is a great part of history and the story of International Harvester, so you're going to learn a lot today. But if you will, join me in welcoming our two speakers.
And check out my International Harvester mask. Ooh. Anyway, welcome and thank you for being here. My name, of course, is Jim Allen, and that's John Glancy, and that's an SSV, which we'll learn about a little bit more than you may know. And what's interesting is that you guys are going to be the first to hear some new information that I've uncovered about this thing, and get your notepads out because there's going to be a quiz. And there is going to be a quiz, but it'll be a quiz with some prizes. So as soon as we're done, John will run the quiz, and he's got some prizes to hand out for people with the right answer. And I see we have a couple people coming in the door. Come on in and have a seat. We'll just let them find their seats. Everybody hear me okay? I don't want to sit here like up here and go.
You can also, if you want, you can pull it out. Or out of the holder.
Well, then I can go into my Frank Sinatra imitations. Okay, so here we are. The Scout was, as you probably all know, an important branch on the family tree of the sport utility vehicle. And it was, a trendsetter in very many ways. But it was kind of an accident. It wasn't really, when International Harvester started this, they really didn't know what the heck they were doing. They really were just looking, basically, to make a compact pickup. But what we're going to talk about today, we're going to get there via a circuitous route. This vehicle here was intended to be a 1981 model year Scout. And they were going to build composite bodied Scouts starting about 1985. I mean, they were working out the details. We all know that they ended in 1980, so a lot of that work was undone. But these are some of the examples of the things that you might have seen down the road in 1984 or 1985. Well, the first thing you have to learn is, and purge your memory of wanting to call this the Scout 3, because it wasn't. There was a very, very brief moment in time when the internal documents were kind of loosely calling this whole series of vehicles Scout 3, but the Scout 3 and the SSV, which stands for Supplementary Scout Vehicle, are two different entities. What they called what was going to be the new Scout for 1984 and 1985, internally they were calling it the High Volume Scout, or HVS. You'll see that referred to here as well. Now, Supplementary Scout Vehicle was going to be something that was going to be in addition to the regular Scouts that were sold in any given year. So they planned on making about 4,000 a year of these until the high volume Scout was out, and then they would have morphed into something else. I mean, obviously the planning didn't go quite the way that they expected. But what we're going to do, I don't know, it looks like we have, I recognize some faces out here, but we are going to talk a little bit about the history of the Scout itself, the original Scout. And right here, we have some evidence that they were intending this to be just an addition to the light truck line. It was going to be a quarter-ton pickup, and what happened is that execs in 1958 went out west and they saw Jeeps doing things that they thought International Harvesters should be doing. In particular, they looked at the CJ6s, which were the long wheelbase CJ Jeeps, and they were sort of like a little mini pickup. Well, they thought, well, why not build a small pickup with four-wheel drive that will be a real pickup instead of just a Jeep with a few extra inches of wheelbase, and that should sell like hotcakes. But they didn't really want to put any money into the project. So they started off with a composite body idea, which was, they expected it to be a little less expensive than a steel-bodied Scout. One of the big costs in developing a new vehicle is developing a steel body and all the dies and everything else, and then every little change you have to make new dies and all this kind of stuff. So they thought composite, where you make a mold and you could change the mold real easy and stamp them out by the hundreds, that would be the thing to do. It didn't quite work out that way, but what we have here, this one over here, that one right there, is kind of the drawing that made the Scout happen. Ted Ornis was having a real problem trying to sell the idea. Once he was told that they wanted a quarter-ton pickup, he was given the task of designing something, but they didn't like anything that he designed. They kept turning him down and turning him down and turning him down, and pretty soon they were losing interest. And so he was sitting down at his kitchen table one evening, and he drew that. And then he showed that to some of the powers that were. They liked it, and then it all started from there. And the rest of these designs here were all kind of evolution of that. And they all had composite bodies. But what happened is that they found out that composite bodies were not as cheap as they thought they were going to be. But I don't know, oops, I accidentally pushed a button here. What they were intending to do is find something unique, and they were looking for a name for it. And if you see over here, the name Scout wasn't in the running early on. But you see here, you see Spartan, you see Spartan here, and some of the other names that they used were Scouter, and the initial documentation, they talked it as, they had all kinds of internal names for it, small 4x4 unit, small 4x4, whatever. Well, eventually, they decided that they were going to, try to get the name Scout. Well, they found out the name Scout was already taken, and a guy in Canada owned the rights to the name Scout, and he had to be paid to get the name Scout, and I'll tell you more about that in a second. Now here, this is what's called a Metro Mite, the AM80. That was developed, that went on the market in late 58, and this was another very innovative thing that International developed, but it was, and immediately when you look at it, you said there's no relation to Scout with this, but the same team that designed this also designed the Scout. And the engine that they chose for this was not an International Harvester engine, because they didn't have a four-cylinder engine that was suitable. And so they bought engines from Austin. You've heard of the Nash Metropolitan? Well, it's the same engine that was in a Nash Metropolitan. And basically, it was kind of a boat anchor. And not even that, because it was so small. It was not a bad engine really in and of itself, but it wasn't really designed to haul around 2,800 pounds of weight. This was designed for a 1,000-pound cargo. It was a very compact van designed for in-city use, but it was a unitized body construction. Now, unitized body will come into it down the road when we talk about the high volume Scout. But this thing was sort of a branch on the family tree of Scout. And it was very innovative. It doesn't get enough credit. Everybody thinks of Jeep fleet vans and Studebaker zip vans and all that. A lot of people forget about the Metro Mite, which was first. Now here we get into the prototype Scouts. And the one up on the upper right, you can see the chassis. That one has an A55 Austin engine in it, and the original 5 or 6 prototypes that they were going to build, they were going to have the A55 engine in it, but along the way, they got an idea. And the idea was to take their V8 engine and cut it in half and make a slant 4-cylinder out of it. And that's really the other thing, besides Ted Ornish developing that drawing we saw earlier and the 4-cylinder engine, those are the 2 things that made the Scout happen. Because if they had gone with the A55 engine, the Scout would have been forgotten pretty quickly. If they had gone with another outside engine, they would have had to pay too much money for it. That, you know, International Harvester wasn't known for throwing money around, so they looked at a lot of other engines. In fact, they even considered powering the Scout with a Jeep engine, but obviously that wasn't politically correct. So what they did is they took their whole line of engines, and they had just recently debuted in 1959 the small V8 series, which came in 266, 304, and 345 cubic inches. And they decided that they were going to do tests of all 3 of those to see which one made the best 4-cylinder. So I know that for sure that they did a half of a 266 and a half of a 304. I couldn't find any records that they did half of a 345, but I know they designed it. Whether they built one for testing, I don't know. But what they discovered is that the 152, which is half of the 304, and the 133, which is half of the 266, they delivered about the same fuel economy, but the 152 made more horsepower. And so they went with the 152, and that's really kind of what saved the Scout. But what we see here are I keep hitting this button. I'm not intending that to happen. What we see here is some of the prototypes. These are all hand-built prototypes of the original Scout, and none of them that we know of survived. But they built the chassis first, and then they developed the bodies. And these are all pictures of prototypes, and they all have prototype numbers on them. If you blow up the pictures enough, you can see the prototype numbers, and there are records. They all had it started with an E and then whatever number, and these are all numbered. There's one that I haven't found any photographic records of, so I don't know about that one. But there's a story about one of the prototype Scouts that was rolled over within days of it being built, and so that might be why I don't see any pictures. Now we get here into the production. The first Scout, of course, which debuted in December of 1960 as a 1961 model, they came basically in 2 platforms, 2-wheel drive and 4-wheel drive, and in 3 body styles, which were a travel top on the bottom left there, a cab top, which is up by the big truck, which was like the pickup version. And then they also had a roadster, which you see up at the top right. But they later developed what they call a panel top, which was basically a travel top with no windows in the side. It was going to kind of make it into a van. But what they learned is they built them as bare bones things, and the travel top, the full station wagon, was almost an afterthought. That almost didn't happen, and the travel top wasn't developed until about 2 months before the debut of the Scout. And it was kind of a last-minute decision to offer a station wagon versus just a pickup. So we saw what their thinking was. And the funny thing is that the travel top ended up being their highest-selling model. Everybody wanted travel tops, nobody wanted cab top pickups. So they had to kind of change gears early in 1961. That, of course, when they develop a new model and they start building them, they kind of make a guess on what the hot seller is going to be. And so they built a bunch of those ahead of time. Well, they built a bunch of cab tops, and nobody wanted the cab tops, so they really had to go into overdrive to build travel tops so that they could sell them. Here I go again. I must be hitting this button. So the first upgrade of the Scout was in 1966, the Scout 800, and it kind of had the same body shell as the Scout 80, but it was especially the interior was really enhanced. They developed several special models, which they discovered in the process of, the latter end of the Scout 80 period. They discovered that the dolled up models, and doll up was an official term that International Harvester used, the ones with more features and more comfort and more conveniences sold better. And they're actually the profit margin was higher on them too. So in '66, they kind of took advantage of that, and they started offering more special models, more dolled up models, and they also developed more powerful engines. And that is when one of their first big challenges came. They learned in 1964, the word got out that Ford was going to be building something that was eventually called the Bronco. And at first, International Harvester was kind of, doing the Barney Fife routine, holding up their pants and thinking, yeah, we started all this, right? Well, then they realized that Ford could make more vehicles in one day than they could make in a year. And they realized that things were going to get mighty tough. Well, then a little later, they learned that Ford was going to offer a V8 in the Bronco and a standard 6-cylinder, and all they had was a 4-cylinder. So they started playing around with trying to get more power out of the 4-cylinder. And then they developed a big bore 4-cylinder, which was half of a 392 V8, which was supposed to be developed at the same time as the others, but they had some design issues with it.
I think the timer's on. I'm going to try it.
Oh, the timer's going on?
I think it's automatically rotating.
Well, that would explain it. I thought, I was being real fumble-fingered here, and the thing is dancing on me, Without her, I need to talk faster.
I just don't know where that's set. Oh, yep, it was on 50 seconds.
It was on 50 seconds. Technical difficulty. But anyway, so we got this power parity issue where they're paranoid that Bronco is going to sell much better than the Scout because they've got a V8. And in the 60s, you weren't crap unless you had a V8, right? So what they decided to do was they thought, okay, we could put V8s in here, but we really want to save the V8 for our completely new Scout, which would become the Scout 2, but they were optimistically planning on having that out in 67, 68, 69, somewhere around in there. They wanted to save the V8 for that. But they soon realized that they were losing the PR battle with the Ford Bronco because of the V8. So they tried to do an economy way of developing more power. Now the big bore 4-cylinder did help, but they tried to turbocharge the 152, and that was a disaster, and they just about, it cost them a lot of money to fix those things to make them run right, and they built less than 1,000 of them anyway. Then they talked about fuel injection. They actually had developed a fuel injection system for the 152, but that didn't make any usable power, so they finally realized they were going to have to bite the bullet and do a V8, so they decided to put the 266 in. And it took a little longer than they expected, so they didn't beat Ford to the draw with the V8, but they were not quite a year later. The V8 came out early in '67, and that was about the Ford V8 came out in March of '66. So they didn't quite make it, but they had power parity with the Bronco. Did that just flip on me again? Okay, so now we go to the Scout 800A. That was basically a delay tactic because all the effort that they put into making the 800, sell better against the Bronco took resources away from developing this, what would become the Scout 2. So the Scout 2 was then behind, so they made an interim model called the 800A. And what they did is they incorporated a lot of the things that they were planning to put in the Scout 2 to kind of liven it up while they developed the Scout 2. One of the things, they had much nicer interiors. They had developed an automatic transmission, a bigger, they put a 304 in it, replaced the 266. So they did a lot of nice things that kept the Scout current against the Bronco. And then there was other things coming out too. And then in 71, they had planned to launch the Scout 2 for 71, but there was more delays, so what they decided to do was develop the 800B, which was essentially an 800A with some minor changes. And the 800A was built, or the 800B was built into March of 1971 when they debuted the Scout 2. And so there was there really wasn't much to talk about the 800B. It was essentially the same thing. But what they did is they just added a few nicer features and a couple of special models, and then they built a bunch of them to carry through until the Scout 2 changeover, and then they stopped rolling these down the line and started rolling the Scout 2s down. So, and actually, the 800B is probably the rarest of the Scout models. They built very few of them overall. And then we get to the Scout 2, which is probably the most popular and famous of the Scouts. And production, they debuted it in April of 1971 in Arizona, but they didn't actually start production until almost the same time. But they did have a bunch of pre-production models that they used for the press debut and the public debut of the Scout 2. But production was really low until like May or June of 1971. So 1971 Scout 2s are relatively rare too, but they built them a little later than they normally did before they transitioned to the 72 models. The history of I'm not going to get too deep into the history of the Scout 2, but one of the things that they offered was a big 345 V8, which gave them parity with the 350 Chevy V8 and some of the other bigger V8s that Ford was offering in some of their products. So, that kept them current. And then they developed a long wheelbase version. They developed the SS2, which you can see in the bottom right there, which is a sporty version, which kind of translated for them for their racing program. So it was, the Scout 2 was very successful and made a fair bit of money for the company. But for a reason I won't go into, they had a lot of trouble. International Harvester had financial problems, and one thing leads to another, and on October 21st, 1980, the Scout went out of production. But they had some serious plans, and during those plans, one of those plans was to, one of those plans was to doll things up, and that helped them sell models. And you can see some of the special models that they came up with. The Spirit of 76 is a fairly rare one. But they developed what they call appliques, which were the side stripes, whatever you want to call them. Now this is relevant to the SSV because they found out that they could sell low production special models, and that they could actually have a pretty high profit margin on them. And so that led into a lot of these different special models, and they were sort of learning those ropes as they went along. And I want to go back to this again because it flipped past me. These are some of the earlier special models that they developed. The red carpet, the sport top convertible, which is the only convertible, true convertible that International Harvester made. The Aristocrat and the Comanche, which is of the early ones is probably the most popular one. Not necessarily the rarest, but one of the most popular ones. But there was a big profit margin to need, and that helped them. Now we get into the SSV. Okay, what's composite? Well, basically composite is a mix of synthetic fibers and resins. That's basically all it is. You could call it plastic. There's lots of different versions of it. Composite is kind of a broad term that covers a lot of different things. But one of the reasons that they wanted to go to composite was because they can develop new body styles very quickly, and they can produce them very quickly. But the problem in developing composites is they were starting to have to worry about crash tests, and the only really large production composite vehicle out there was the Corvette. And the Corvette did okay in crash tests, but there was a big learning curve for those, especially for International Harvester. Now, they had started earlier building fiberglass front ends for trucks for weight savings, and they had some experience with that. But in 1973, they decided that they wanted to build complete bodies out of fiberglass. And their first project was a streamlined cab over truck. And so they realized how much they really didn't know. So they hired a guy named Leo Windecker, the guy pictured right there. They hired him because he had developed a lot of expertise in composite structures, and had actually developed the world's first composite aircraft. And it actually was an FAA certified airplane that was built basically out of fiberglass. And so he had a lot of gravitas in the business at that point, but he didn't really want to get involved initially. But in 1975, they were able to talk him into the company and hire him as a consultant, and he started developing their composite processes, and they actually built a laboratory for him near his home in Midland, Texas, and that's where he started developing the technology that he used to build the SSVs and what would have been the high volume Scout down the road. Now, one of the things you can see is up on the left, that is a layout of a Scout steel body with 112 individual stampings, and the first generation SSV down here, considerably lighter, and only had 7 parts. And those pieces were to be glued together, and that was one of the early technology problems they had, was developing adhesives to glue. The panels weren't so hard to make, but to glue those panels together, that was a bit difficult. So one of the big things that that Windecker had to work on was the adhesives, and there was lots of adhesives out there that he could use, but he needed to get all the science together and get all the experts together and figure out what worked best in this environment. And plus the fact, one of the things that was coming up too, by the way, is gas saving. This was during the first gas crunch, and everybody was looking for better fuel economy, and the weight savings is one way to get fuel economy. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever seen the little go-karts. They're highly collectible now. You can buy a pretty decent used car for what you have to pay for one of those now. But those were built by a company called FW and Associates that manufactured those golf carts, and they were actually known for that. They built little go-karts, lots of different muscle cars and vans and all kinds of silly stuff that they developed. They would license with companies, license with Ford, license with Chrysler, and they obviously licensed with International to develop those little mini SS2. Well, what most people don't know, and that I didn't know until about 2 months ago, is that they had an idea, that company, to develop a fiberglass bodied van, and they hit up International Harvester for 2 chassis. International Harvester sent them 2 chassis, and that was what it was going to look like. And they worked on the bodies. They actually had one prototype, but International Harvester did not like it. So the guy's name was Fred Wagenhals. He's still alive, and I talked to him recently. But he was sent 2 chassis, and they had one built up, with a body similar to that on it. And but International Harvester turned it down, and then a couple of years later, they wanted the chassis back. And he ended up buying them. And in 1979, some of you may have seen these. There was 10 like stagecoaches built on Scout chassis, and he's the guy that did those. And eventually, I'll have pictures of those. But they were pretty seriously ugly. But the 2 chassis that he ended up buying from International were turned into like imagine a stagecoach built onto a Scout chassis. And apparently, Burt Reynolds had one, and he was weird enough to probably enjoy something like that. Okay, so now we know going back in time that International was no stranger to composites because we've got the original Scout. That was kind of almost the final design what the composite body Scout was going to look like in 1961, and that's a drawing of the various pieces. But and the body was to be made out of royalite, which was a product that was pretty new in the late 50s and early 60s. It was more of a plastic than a composite, but we don't need more of those details. But some of the other things that they worked on was here was the Scout 85, which was when they were transitioning to the Scout 2. They were thinking, okay, what can we do with all these Scout 800 chassis? We could build something like this Scout 85 onto using a lot of those old dies and such. And so they actually built 3 of these, or they only assembled 1, but they had 3 bodies built like that. And they were, in a way, you can think of this as sort of the prototype SSV. It was essentially going to be a limited production vehicle that they could sell in addition to the regular Scouts. But they didn't like it, and I don't know, looking at that and looking at this, I think I'd rather have this, frankly, but each their own. And this was just a design thing that Ted Ornish did. I don't know anything about it other than that it existed, and it was built on a 2-wheel drive Scout chassis. Now this almost happened. They were developing a composite top for the Scout 800s. And it was going to be, like a fiberglass top like what they had in the later Scouts. But they had trouble with the glue, gluing the pieces together, and they had trouble with getting the tailgate to stay in place. The tailgate wanted to fall off. So they ended up not going for that, but that was as early as 1967. Okay, so in about 1978, this was what they had sort of tentatively planned for 1984, 1985. Now, the booklet that these came out of was called Unitized Composite Scout. Now, what they had morphed this into, they weren't going to use Scout chassis like they did on this. They were going to develop a complete composite fiberglass body that was going to have subframes on it. And they were going to actually be front-wheel drive, where you engaged 4-wheel drive and it engaged the rear axle. And they knew that they had to get rid of their own engines. In '78, they knew that their engines didn't have the legs to make it into the 80s very far because of emission control. So they were looking at a lot of outside engines. These things are going to be really light, like under 4,000 pounds. Now, these sort of served a dual purpose in the styling area because you can see the resemblance of the sports enthusiast to this. So they were kind of recycling designs that they were working on for the SSV into that. But what's most interesting maybe are the 2 on the left, like the minivan, which does bear a striking resemblance to Wagenhall's design from a couple of years earlier for the, you know, the red van we saw earlier. Here we go again. So it's going to be a 4-door minivan on a 118-inch wheelbase chassis. And that's something that could have sold. 4-wheel drive, 4-door, plenty of room inside. Now, and I don't know about you, but that one up on top, the family cruiser, even though it's a short wheelbase 2-door, that's a pretty nice looking rig, I think. So these are the kind of things that they had in their minds that when they were working on it. And the front wheel drive aspect, I mean, who knows what they would have actually done. I've never seen any of the actual engineering work that was done on it, but they were working on it. And here's some of the other ideas that they had. The Trava, which obviously, you know, kind of trades on the Travelall. A 4-door station wagon, which could probably be front-wheel drive with rear 4-wheel drive, or just front-wheel drive. But a 4-door station wagon that kind of looks 80s. They designed an RV, which was going to be on a 180-inch wheelbase. It was going to be a fully self-contained RV. The Ultra on the left, I don't know what that was all about, but I mean, it just shows that they were thinking. And on the right was the Elva, which was also a front-wheel drive composite body, another minivan. So I mean, these are the kind of things that they had in their mind for the mid and late 80s. Oh, and one other thing, you know, in the RV front, they designed a fiberglass pull-behind trailer. You know, like a regular camper trailer. Okay, now we go back a little bit in time to October of '75, and this is when the SSV idea really started. This is where that's a time when the high volume Scout, you know, the later 1985 Scout and the SSV kind of separated. So, and that was the first rendering that Chuck Harris did that I know of for what would become the SSV. And here are some, you know, about the same time, some of the ideas they were working on for the high volume Scout for the future. You know, make of it what you will. That just shows what they were working on. Now here we get into the design of pretty much, they worked out the SSV. Now this is a quarter scale model that they built of it. And you know, if you don't look close, you could almost think that was an existing vehicle. Now, you'll see that that I have used the term SSV 95 and SSV 100. Those are my terms, not international, but I needed a code for myself to figure out between the 95-inch wheelbase. These were intended to be a 95-inch wheelbase. They were actually going to shorten the chassis of the Scout to 95 inches. And that's what they were going to do with these. And they actually, what they did is they sliced the chassis and they put a sleeve in there, and it was actually the same sleeve that they used to stretch the 118-inch. You know, the 118s have that sleeve in them to stretch the chassis, but they were going to do just the opposite with that and use the sleeve to shorten the chassis. So, which kind of makes no sense, but that's what they were intending to do. So I use the term SSV 95 and SSV 100 because these sit on a standard 100-inch chassis. Now, the other thing that I discovered that I didn't know, this was the SSV 95 was called Project 459, and I didn't actually know that until about 2 weeks ago. I finally ran across some paperwork that talked about it under that terminology. Well, at this time it flipped at the right time. May of 1976. This was the first clay model, one of the first clay models that they did of the SSV 95. And this one you can see is a coupe. And it's pretty nice looking, I have to say. Now, one of the things I want to point out, and this could have been a family cruiser, but if you look at the front end, you see there's two front ends. Now with clay models, they can make one side look like one thing and the other side look like something else. And you can see that they had two different treatments on the front end for this. Another thing I want you to point out too is, see that little bat wing feature on the hood where it scoops down on the wheel well? Just pay attention to that, you'll see that slowly evolve away as we look at more prototypes. Now here we get closer to the true concept, and this was a play model of what they call the sports model or the off-roader model. And this one, had paint and everything, so they're getting pretty close to a finalized design. Now, this they had pretty much decided on the supplemental aspect of the Supplemental Scout Vehicle. That was all firmly entrenched. They were working towards that at this point. And here we see the very first SSV prototype being built. Now this is an SSV 95. I have not found the line set ticket for this chassis yet. I would dearly love to find it, but I don't have enough clues to dig it out of the file yet. But this is when it was in the design center being built in prototype. And they ordered a standard Scout chassis, shortened it, and Windecker by then had developed the bodies and was sending bodies from Midland, Texas to Fort Wayne. So the SSV was well on its way to being done at this point in February of 1977. And here we see that same prototype in a couple of different guises. It was finished in April, and they immediately took it out and got some frequent flyer miles, as you can see on the left. But they didn't have it quite finished out yet. So over there on the right, you can see it in kind of in its unfinished form. But in the lower left, they dolled it up very much like they did with this, and put the dual sunroofs on, the polycast. Well, actually, those are alloy wheels, not the polycast wheels, and pinstriping and all that kind of stuff. Filled out the interior a little bit more. And they used that vehicle, the one on the lower left, for a market survey. They took that around to dealers around the country and invited people to come into the dealers and look at it and then fill out a survey form. And I guess they got 129 survey forms back, and it was all pretty positive. So they thought, yeah, we can sell some of these, and that's when they kind of had the confidence to say we could probably sell 4,000 a year of these. That's when they developed this, thinking that they could use it as an addition to whatever regular model Scout that they were producing at the time. And they also, of course, all the executives saw it, and it went to a couple of race events and things like that where they got to show it off. Now here, this is probably the most important aspect of the SSV development, is figuring out what happens to a fiberglass vehicle when it gets in a wreck. Because crash testing was getting pretty big in those days. So every vehicle had to be crash tested. What you see on the left is it was May 3rd, 1978. And what we see Leo Windecker on the far left with Ted Ornis, the legendary Ted Ornis, next to their first crash test vehicle. We still haven't figured out who the guy was on the right. If anybody recognizes him, let me know. I've asked a lot of people, and nobody knows for sure who he is. Somebody said he was the plant manager, but that doesn't work out either, so we're still looking for who that guy was. But the documentation says that they were going to crash test six of the SSV 95s, and the documentation that I've seen indicates that they could have built as many as 23 like this. Some for crash testing and some for building up as complete vehicles that you saw, the earlier one. Now, that picture on the right is something that John turned up in just a pile of stuff. A really bad picture of the after effect of a crash test on an SSV. And actually, they did pretty well. They didn't have any particular issues with it, and I think it was going to make the cut as far as the crash test. But look at the number on the lower one, 185, and the number 189 there. So we know at least 4 of them were crash tested. And there's some other pictures around too, but that was one of the big things that they had to work out, was to make sure that that thing was going to be safe in a crash test. Now here's another version by Mr. Dick Hatch, who is still with us and lives not far away. He was one of the designers at Ted Ornis's department that eventually took over that department. But this was the family cruiser or coupe version of the SSV 95. And again, that's a pretty nice looking machine. Obviously, it wouldn't have had much of a back seat in it, but the looks are good. Now here we have a second dolled up SSV 95 prototype. And this one is kind of interesting because this is the only instance where we ever learn about a tentative name, marketing name that they were going to use for this line of vehicle, because they would have come up with something at some point. Well, Pajero, whatever you want to call it, if you can speak Spanish, you probably pronounce it differently. That's the only time we ever see a name on any of this. And this is the only one we ever see the name on. But you can see they pinstriped it, they painted it the same color as this, and that's a completely different, that's a different vehicle than the other one. This is a completely different one. And this one turns up again in later. This vehicle actually survived. It's owned by a trucking company owner, but it hasn't seen the light of day in a long time, and nobody really has access to it. But it does survive. And Mitsubishi also had a vehicle that they called by that same name, but it wasn't sold here in the United States. And this vehicle also made the rounds of publicity, events, at race events, and all that kind of stuff. Now here's when we start with the SSV 100, and this is from October of 1978. So we know that the SSV 100 concept predates that, but this is the earliest photographic evidence I could find of it, which was early in October of 78. And the documentation says that the project to build this officially started October 1st, 1978, and it was called Project 501. And this is the clay model. Not much to say about it other than that, you can see that this is the kind of the prototype for this one. And they plan to use the standard Scout 100-inch chassis, which wouldn't require too many changes. Basically a new fuel tank, a couple of different body mounts, some changes in wiring and all that. So they could use a pretty standard Scout chassis. That was the goal, and that made it less expensive to develop. Now here, in the summer of 1978, this is more or less the final sort of blueprint for how the bodies were made on these. And again, they don't show all the pieces, but we actually have one of those pieces here in the parts pile here. But normally there's supposed to be 16 parts making up the SSV 100 body. And this is more or less the final thing. All these pieces were glued together using high-tech adhesive, and that's how they were built. And the bodies weighed like 340 pounds. So in theory, two guys could pick this body up. Not two guys like me, but two guys. And they were working on some automation to build these panels. So in fact, they had a whole factory layout already designed of how these body parts were going to be built and glued together. And they actually had robots designed to build these panels. There's pictures of them in some of the documentation. Now here is the summer of 1979. We don't know the exact date of this, but this is some of the people in the prototype lab. They're all named down here, and some of you old IH hands might recognize some of those names. We're pretty sure that is this vehicle, but just recently I found some material, and you'll see some of the pictures, that there was more than just one of these like this built. And so I'm not 100% sure that that's this vehicle, but it'll become clear as we move along. But anyway, these you can see another body there on the far left, which is an unpainted body. But we know that a bunch of these, or several of these, were painted this same color. But you can see this one also hasn't been pinstriped yet. the pinstriping and stuff that's on this wasn't on it yet, and of course it's still got the white spoke wheels on it instead of the polycast wheels. Now here is this vehicle and the line set ticket. This rolled off the line as a standard Scout, and it was especially ordered in a group of 11. They were all identical. They all had identical line set tickets, and I'm in the process of getting those now. I just recently discovered the VINs for them, so I ordered up the line set tickets from Wisconsin Historical Society, so I'll soon know that they were all built identically as this one. 345 automatic, 307 gears, air conditioning, but they had pretty much a gutted interior. They just had 2 black bucket seats in them when they were ordered. And this is from a previous time in 2016. The museum was gracious enough it hadn't been outside since the 90s, and they brought it downstairs, and we rolled it around different places down in the area down there by the other museum, and they allowed us to take pictures of it for the first edition of the Scout book. But we know that the chassis was built March 20th of 1979. We know that the first body arrived May 4th, and that they trickled in until they had 14 bodies. And not all of them were painted this color, but quite a number of them were. We're pretty sure that this one is probably, and I haven't confirmed this yet, but I will be able to soon. Whoops. That this is prototype number 6. And it would have worn the experimental chassis number of E779. And I'll be able to confirm that. And if this is that one, then this one was completed on August 3rd of 1979. So, and that is the line setting ticket, in case you didn't know. Every Scout that rolled down the line had a build sheet, and that is everything that was on this vehicle. And every Scout has one, and the Wisconsin Historical Society has on microfilm the line setting tickets for every Scout ever built, and a good number of all the International Harvester trucks that were built. And you can order them either through a Scout Lightline dealer, of which John is one, or directly from the Wisconsin Historical Society. So if you have a Scout and you're going to restore it, that's job one, to find out exactly how it was built. And we don't know the polycast wheels. The latest picture that I have of this vehicle without these wheels on it was for like May 21st, and so the wheels and stuff were put on this sometime after that. Now this shows some of the internal structure of the body, and those kind of roll areas they weren't like embedded parts, but they were rolls of what they called unidirectional fiber bundles, and they were designed to give the body strength. And I just ran across these pictures. There's not much context, but it just kind of shows you how they were reinforcing the body. Now they scheduled, I haven't found that they actually crash tested any of these, but they were scheduled to crash test the first one in March of 1979. But I don't have any evidence that they actually did. But I suspect they did. Now here's May of 1980. Well, we all know what happened. You know, there was a big strike starting in December of 79 and worked through April of 1980. And basically nothing was going on here. But of course, the design labs and stuff were still open. But in April, when they came back online, by that time the decision had been made that we are either going to sell the Scout division to somebody or we're going to shut it down. And they had a couple of buyers interested. They had one buyer that was pretty serious, but as part of that, putting the whole division up for sale, they had this big prospectus thing saying, well, look how great we are, look at all these prototypes we've developed, look at where we're headed. Well, these pictures are from that portfolio where they said, look at our future model that we've developed and all that. Now, of course it was for sale, but of course you had to buy the entire Scout division to get this, but it was for sale. And it was just, of course, we know that nothing ever came of that. So now we go back to the high volume Scout, and these are some further examples of what in 1985 you might have seen for a Scout. Now on the upper left for 81, they were pretty close to being finished with a new top design. Basically what they were going to do is take the top from the Traveler, which was fiberglass, and shorten it to fit on a short wheelbase, which, you know, kind of modernizes. I mean, they really look, it really takes that old Scout body and makes it look more modern to have these lines. And so this was a prototype that they developed, and this is more than likely this is what you would have seen in the 1981 model year Scouts. And also this dashboard is the same dashboard that they used in the SSV, and you can see a couple of samples here of them. That dashboard was going to be in the 1981 Scouts too, because the original dash was kind of dated, so they wanted to update it. So, you know, John, that has the up-high radio too, doesn't it? Yeah, so anyway, we're just geekily talking about the placement of the radio on that dash, wondering if that might be a Scout 2 dash and not an SSV dash. But some of the other things that they were working on here were designs like this, which were pretty nice looking. And if they remind you of a Range Rover, you're not the only one that's come up with that. But I never saw, other than the minivan, I never saw any evidence that they were working on a 4-door. But that doesn't mean that they weren't. I just haven't seen it. But you know that that's where the sport utility market went. The 4-door was what pretty much ruled the sport utility market, not too far down the road from when this would have happened. And here we got another automatic flip. Well, these are survivors. Now, the one on the left is the Bajero, which is owned by J.B. Hunt, or was owned by J.B. Hunt. This is a picture of it stored away not all that long ago, and it's just sitting there. And the one in the middle is an experimental body that Windecker had in Texas, and you can tell it's a 95-inch wheelbase body on a 100-inch chassis. We don't know how that came about, but the story goes that he used it on his ranch. You know, he probably had the body laying around experimental, needed a hack-around rig on the ranch, so they stuck the body. Down below it is the only other surviving coupe body, which is owned by John Firth, and I'm pretty sure that body is one of the first 2 bodies that they built for the coupe that were sent out from Texas, and they were sent to for evaluation. They weren't necessarily intended to be put onto a chassis, but they were just to be there for everybody to look at and do some testing on, and so on and so forth. Because that's the story about how that body got locked into the back of a warehouse over in product reliability, and then a couple of years down the road, they were looking to clear things out, and Mr. Firth ended up with that body, and he was going to maybe build a race car out of it or something, but never did. But you know, you saw that body at homecoming the last couple of years too. Now, what we see on the right is one of the 2 remaining chassis, both of which John here owns. And that's been confirmed. The chassis that you see there as one of the brothers to this. And but what happened is when they sold those bodies, or when they ended the company, they scrapped the bodies. They sold the running gear. And I guess John can tell the story about how you ended up with those, right?
There's a guy named Bill Kraus, one of the fellows that went to the auctions when they quit the Scout line, and he bought skids of parts, and some of it was off production out of the factory, and some of it was from engineering. And I had been buying from him for years, and this stuff, those were buried behind his garage and thrown over and covered. And that stuff was in bins that were totally grown over. So all those years I've been buying from him, I didn't know what they were. And then I bought him out. So we were clearing everything out and unearthed those and figured out what they were. And that's basically how I got this going.
So I was able to track the VIN on that one chassis shown there. Now the chassis on the left of that, we looked and didn't see a VIN on it. And we're going to have to go back and look again because the documentation says that they wanted 11 identical chassis. And I found 10 of the 11 VIN numbers. And so the only thing I can think of is they built one without a VIN, which means that it might have been just an incomplete chassis, built as an incomplete chassis, or who knows. But we're going to go back and make sure because they're awful rusty, and sometimes, as you know, an old rusty chassis, sometimes it's hard to pull the VIN number off of it. Now here we have some evidence before they were scrapped. Now check this one. This is not this, okay? This is the scrap pile, and if you look, okay, you can see that one there. That's obviously a bronze colored one. So that could be the one in that previous picture. But there's another one, another painted body right there. And these are bad pictures. But there's another painted body right there. And if you look on the side of this one that's unpainted, right over here, there's another painted body right there. And we also have the evidence of that painted door right there, which is painted the same color. So those came off of something. And so it lends some weight to the idea that they decided they wanted 11 exactly alike, built to the same spec. So we now know that there was at least 2 built to that same spec. That gives us, that would be this one and this one here. And that one looks like, from what little you can see in the picture, looks like it was a complete vehicle too. So that leads you the impression of 3, and there's another picture that gives me the impression that there might have been a 4th. But again, that's a close-up of the chassis that John has. John has this dream of mating this chassis to John Firth's body, and putting one together. Of course, I don't know that John wants to sell his body, but anyway. Oh, interestingly, John's chassis is 21 numbers apart from this one. So, and it was built the same day. And this one, John's chassis is marked 11 of 11, because usually when they order it in a batch, they will say 1 of 11, 2 of 11, 3 of 11, 4 of 11, 5 of 11. This, John's was 11 of 11. This one was 2 of 11. So, but this VIN number is, I think, later than John's. But they didn't necessarily roll down the line by VIN number. They had what they call the line sequence number. They always went down in that line sequence number, even if the VINs, generally speaking, the VINs were consecutive, but not all. So that's just little details that have to be worked out. And that would be about it. So, ask any questions you would like. But we are going to have a quiz, and John's going to run the quiz. And then after that, we have books here, some swag. You can look over the parts here. And of course, we'll both sign any books that you guys want to buy.